Pendleton on high alert. We know, since you mentioned 2020, that President Trump, during those Black Lives Matter protests at the time, had wanted to use active duty U.S. troops on the streets of a major city. The 82nd Airborne at the time was called up. They were not sent into the streets. What exactly do you set as Homeland Security Secretary as your benchmark for when you would counsel the President of the United States to send active duty troops in to police a domestic disturbance?
Well, my hope is always that we work with local leaders that would do their jobs. And that is what has failed in LA, is that the mayor has refused to recognize the dangerous situation that she's perpetuating, as well as the governor. When we ask for backup in a situation, LAPD has waited hours to respond, and they've waited until we have an officer in a dangerous situation until they come in and help us bring peace. Oftentimes in these cities, you have good leaders that help give backup to other law enforcement officers, but you have politicians who won't give that kind of resource when it's needed. Unfortunately, waiting several hours for LAPD to show up, or telling them us that they're not going to back us up until they have an officer in a dangerous situation, is something that just isn't workable when you have violent protests going on. So
the U.S.
work better with us, but that's one of the reasons that you've seen the National Guard come in and help us with those security operations.
Well, the U.S. Attorney in L.A. told CBS that LAPD did help. LAPD does not.
That's what is to me, Margaret, is hours later. They waited until we had officers in dangerous situations, then they responded. Now, if that was my city and I was the mayor, I would be sent law enforcement in there to back up other law enforcement officers. That's what America is about, is that we have rules and we have laws. If you don't like the laws, go to Congress and change them. Someone should go to Congress and say, change the laws. If we don't like what's happening in this country, do that instead of throwing rocks and throwing Molotov cocktails, and instead of attacking law enforcement officers. We're just not going to anymore. This president cares deeply about family members that want to live in their communities and be safe.
Back to the question, though, of active duty troops, different from the National Guard. What is your personal counsel here to the president? Because it's you, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of Defense. We're going to have a lot of responsibility here in implementing some of this call to do this.
Well, let me be clear about something. ICE and Homeland Security are running these operations right now, and the advice and counsel of the Attorney General, the Department of Defense, are extremely important to the President of the United States, and we never discuss our personal conversations and advice to the President of the United States. He makes the decisions. He is the president that sits in that seat, and we are all very proud to work for him. So I'm grateful for the leadership of Pete Hegseth and Pam Bondi, and I get the chance to work with them. And as does their job today, we're thankful to have the partnership and the leadership of President Trump.
Well, some Republican senators, like Senator Lankford, have said active duty Marines are not going to be put into local law enforcement. So there are Republican lawmakers questioning this. To the question about where we are seeing the National Guard troops centered around this Roybal Center, CBS is reporting undocumented immigrants attending their ICE check-ins were being detained and held overnight in the basement of that building. And there were lawyers for some of those detainees claiming it was illegal because the migrants were held in makeshift facilities with limited access to food and water. That was one of the sources of the protest. Can you vouch for these facilities? And do you understand what some of these protesters are concerned about?
Well, these protests started long before we ended up in the situations that we saw when we were trying to secure these individuals and the law enforcement officers involved. What I would say is getting individuals in and out of those facilities was extremely challenging when the violence broke out and when things were being thrown at vehicles and people were rocking vehicles and shaking them, trying to break into them. In fact, we had to send a swift response team in to get a female officer out of her vehicle safely in those situations. So we are following all the laws and procedures as we always do. But when you have violence like that, the safety of everybody involved is incredibly important, and we'll make sure that we get people through them without injury as best to our ability.
Secretary Noem, we're going to have to leave.